Is Pokemon getting worse and worse? Here's what we'll do. We'll alternate between aspects where the series used to do things better and others where it's currently superior, and so on, so you can draw your own conclusions. The point of this video is for you to share your own thoughts in the comments so we can get as rich a perspective as possible on all of this. Point for the old school. Artistic style. At the dawn of the series, the young Game Freak embraced pixel art in an attempt to fulfill Ken Sugimori's manga dreams within the huge limitations of the old Game Boy. Even so, from the very beginning, those few pixels were strangely capable of accurately reflecting the unique character of such different creatures, whether it was an imposing Charizard, a wobbly Clefairy, or a sleepy Snorlax. Those limitations quickly became a strength, a choice, an identity, an art that Game Freak kept perfecting generation after generation until it became the top authority in the industry. And with the jump to 3D, it's hard not to feel like all that evolution was thrown overboard. Junichi Masuda himself admitted that pixel art has a unique flavor, a clarity that 3D just can't recreate. The jump to 3D wasn't something that happened overnight. During the 5th generation, there were many experiments, and even in the 6th, there were doubts. They were ready to scrap prototypes and revert to pixel art if the final product didn't convince. Even now, Game Freak is still mainly a 2D developer, with the former pixel artists redirected to concept art and the 3D assets outsourced to external companies. What I'm getting at with all this is that it's not a matter of nostalgia for retro or just aesthetic preferences. Pixel art was Pokemon's style, and the change was more of a concession to the market and what the audience was asking for than an artistic evolution. It's not that the Pokemon models are bad, but for all the reasons we've discussed, they do feel cold, closed-off interpretations that leave no room for imagination. Looking for a note of optimism, the recent releases of my beloved Dragon Quest give me some hope. Pixel art has recently been gaining unexpected value and appreciation, so just as until recently I thought it was completely impossible for Pokémon to return to 2D, maybe now there's a chance we'll see something like that in a future. And in line with that optimism, a point for the current games: innovation and boldness. If there's one thing you can deny about the most recent generations, in contrast to the first ones, it's their spirit of bringing us new experiences. In the early stage of the franchise, it was all about iterating and progressively improving the formula through small changes so that the series would grow alongside veteran players. But in the more recent generations, especially since the 7th, there's a much more disruptive spirit, with each edition wanting to show us a different vision of the Pokemon world, like the Island Challenge, the Galar Star League, the Journey to the Past in Legends Arceus, or the Treasure Hunt in Paldea. The execution of these ideas may be more or less questionable, but you can't deny that Pokemon is taking risks that would have seemed unimaginable just a few years ago. All of these approaches, to a greater or lesser extent, have given us valuable and enriching moments. It's not that the previous formula of gradual evolution was wrong. On the contrary, it was necessary to build the foundation of a Pokemon world so vibrant that today it can afford to play with expectations and show us such valuable perspectives that make this world infinite and unforgettable. Now, a point for the old school: going all out. I'm not really sure how to title this point, but it feels like there was a time when games were made by going all in, putting everything on the line without worrying about what would come next. A period shorter than it seems, maybe limited to just the first 2 generations, since by the 3rd, Pokemon was already a fully established phenomenon, and Game Freak started looking more toward the future. Being strategic so that the content in the games wouldn't overshadow upcoming releases. For example, wiping out a large part of the Kanto and Johto Pokédex, knowing that it would serve as an incentive to play the upcoming remakes. But in the first 2 generations, they focused solely and exclusively on making those cartridges as close as possible to the ultimate experience of their beloved Pokemon world. It's true that in the first one they made mistakes due to inexperience in many ways, but the revolution it brought to the world of video games is clear proof that they poured every bit of their spirit into creating something something magical. Not to mention the second generation. We're no longer going in blind with the anime and manga already existing and having a much clearer vision of what that world was. They pushed their limits even further to bring to life something so grand at the time that it remains relevant and enjoyable to this day. From Hoenn onward, however, things started to change. It was no longer so much about squeezing every last drop out of that particular cartridge, but about looking at the series in the long run. Including old regions in the post-game? What for when you could just release remakes? The third legendary? There will be time to explore its story, leaving it in its debut games as something completely anecdotal. Tons and tons of elements that could have easily seen the light in the first editions of each generation, greatly enriching the story and experience, were deliberately left out, with future products in mind. And some of you might say this was done from the beginning with Yellow and Crystal, but I don't quite see it that way. In Yellow, for example, the inclusion of the 3 starters was a tribute to the events of the anime, which made no sense in Red and Blue. And Suicune's story in Crystal is a completely new side quest that doesn't interfere with the main legendaries. And although this isn't very well known, the original Battle Tower was first introduced in Japan to be played together with the Game Boy Mobile adapter. In other words, it wasn't something they could have included in Gold and Silver, since it used very new technology, although later on in the Western versions, fortunately it was unlocked so that everyone could access it at any time. And let's not even get started on the more recent generations in this regard, DLCs, although to me they're a bit less outrageous than straight up selling you another game just for that extra content, are adventures that could have easily been included in the base game, not to mention the shamelessness of the Pokédex expansions. One thing is cutting down the Pokédex, which, although disappointing for many, does make some sense if you consider that the total number of Pokémon is becoming increasingly hard to manage, and the idea is to get players familiar with the new species in each generation. But deliberately leaving Pokémon out of the final games, only to add them later in the DLC, that's just shady, man. Not even someone like me, who considers the 9th generation one of the best Pokémon experiences of my life, can find much of that cheerful enthusiasm from Game Freak to make each cartridge their masterpiece anymore. Point for the current ones: character. Something I think there's no doubt about. Pokemon has been improving in this aspect as the generations go by. From the endearing but generic archetypes of the first 2 generations, with the honorable exceptions of Silver and Red from the 2nd generation, who were surprisingly revolutionary, by the 3rd generation we started to see stories with more substance, closer to the JRPGs of that era. Still light and aimed at a younger audience, but in the 5th generation, everything changed, and since then, we've continued to see truly rich characters who bring very different and original stories and perspectives about what drives each person to become a Pokemon trainer. Honestly, that's probably my biggest motivation for sticking around these days. Point for the old ones: exploration. Doesn't need much explanation, right? It's really sad how the older regions, despite all their technical limitations, manage to excite you about what you might find in the next city, reward your curiosity with epic encounters, and create an aura of mystery and the feeling that the world was endless, something that's been completely missing lately. Not even the open worlds, which were supposed to shine in this aspect, have managed to recreate that excitement. I know that the innocence with which we approach those worlds can distort this perception, but when in Galar, outside of the DLCs, we didn't find a single location that made you want to get lost and start asking questions, I knew something had been lost, that we had entered a straight and irreversible path. Another more controversial point I give to the new games is the Pokemon themselves. Of course, since they're still characters, and the same way they've been writing better stories for them, the pocket monsters keep bringing us more interesting, rich, and original concepts. It's not that the ones from Kanto were a disaster and the current ones are perfect, nor that the only real Pokemon are the original 151, as some nostalgic fans swear. Each of these creatures was born in a very different context, and it's pretty unfair to judge them in hindsight. But I think it's hard to deny that the team in charge has been gaining more and more mastery in the art of creating Pokemon. Each Pokédex represents its culture better than the last, has more interesting twists, and is a stronger lineup overall. And yes, with every new design that's revealed, the internet explodes and these poor creatures get a ton of hate without anyone even stopping to think about what they're trying to do with them. But try this exercise. Imagine if the latest generation was the first, and vice versa. Don't you think people would idolize these creatures and call the Kanto ones lazy and generic? Maybe even more so in that case. Imagine if Garbodor was from the first generation and Muck was from the fifth. Most likely people would praise the first god of poison-type Pokemon, with implicit social critique and a design that perfectly fits what it represents. A true masterpiece. Meanwhile, Muck would be called out as the laziest design in history and live in proof that they've run out of ideas. And it's the same with everything. Every Pokédex has its highs and lows, but looking at it from a broader perspective, I think this is one area where Pokemon has only gotten better. And that's a good sign, because at the end of the day, what brings us to Pokemon are the Pokemon themselves. As I said, this is an endless topic. So show the video some love, and above all, let's turn the comment section into a real debate. Share your points for both new and old games, and let's see if together we can come up with the clearest possible perspective. Maybe we can make new parts for this section if you convince me of something I hadn't seen until now. For now, if you're left wanting more, follow me on social media to keep up with my art. I have commissions open and I'm in the middle of moving, so you'd really be helping me out if you ordered a drawing from me. And above all, be good.